That's right.
I wanted to shift a little bit to talk about the generational, intergenerational, because you talk about that a lot. Your first book was about that generational code. The second book also has a chapter around how the different generations view this differently. I just want to get your insight into, especially from a leadership perspective, and it's a leadership podcast where leaders are managing different types of people, and they're being even ICs I consider as leaders. How do they work with people who are different generations? So give us a little bit of insight into that and what's emerging for you from that study.
Oh, absolutely. I love it. So it's an interesting thing that each generation, as they entered the workforce, entered into a conversation about what work is. For our traditionalists, they came into work and they were coming on as workers or laborers. And it was, hey, if you get a roof over your head while you're working, that's a really good thing. And you become loyal to the company, and whatever the company says, you do it, no questions asked. And leaders were considered bosses, right? You do what they say, like a boss in the military, no questions asked. And so work was not a place that you expected to feel comfortable or self-actualized. Then along come our baby boomers. And there are 80 million baby boomers born in the United States because it's post
Mhm.
World War II, boom, of kids, right? And so there's this constant competition going on. Every single baby boomer knows there are 1,000 other people that want this job, right? And so baby boomers come in and they are not just laborers and workers. Now they are employees and they're loyal to the institution, but they also feel like they're somewhat trapped. If they've got a mean, miserable boss, you can't move because moving meant getting behind. You didn't necessarily do anything until you could move, till you had another job, and you could get behind when you moved to another job. So our baby boomers kind of were always in this ongoing game of musical chairs. And as employees, they were constantly looking left, looking right, and trying to figure out the politics of it. Now, politics are stressful. I don't know anybody that says, woohoo. Well, I shouldn't say that. I think some people enjoy the stress of politics, but that's a different thing. So our baby boomers kind of were running on this overworking 80-hour week, kind of like a badge of honor that they would wear on their sleeve of overworking, overworking, overproducing. So what was really interesting is that that became the definition of their character, was being a workaholic. And they would proudly say how many hours they work and they would compare that. And then along come Gen Xers, and we only had 44 million Gen Xers born for a couple of reasons. One, baby boomers got divorced, first generation to have massive divorce, but we also saw birth control come in. And so there was just far less Gen Xers being born. And when they were born, a lot of them were left alone to raise themselves because both mom and dad, or mom or dad, went into the workplace. And so they became that first generation of latchkey kids. So this becomes really important for their nervous systems because they spent a lot of time as a kid having to take care and regulate and protect themselves. And
Hmm.
so they didn't grow up with as much attachment or connection or sense of safety. And so they became very, very um, conscious of constantly being on and having to fight for what they were wanting to achieve because nobody was fighting for it for them. Now, this gets changed a little bit when baby boomers have their second wave of kids, the millennials. And when the
Hmm.
millennials came along, many baby boomers had gotten remarried or they'd waited to have a baby. And so with the millennials, now they were all in. Now they went to every activity with the kid, every kid got a trophy, all these different things happened. And millennials grew up as a cherished generation that were really wanted and desired. Where Gen Xers were a little bit like, oh yeah, we had a baby and a Gen Xer. I mean, we're happy for it, but we want to get on with our
I,
career, right? Just
yeah,
ask a
I
Gen
love
Xer.
it.
They'll
I
tell
mean, you
you,
describing this so vividly and well. I love it.
just ask a Gen Xer that has a millennial sibling, like by the few years in between them, they're like, I don't know who their parents were, but those were not the same people that raised me. I just do not understand this. And all the millennials, by this time, there was after school care and all these different things. So they grew up knowing that they were wanted and also grew up playing on teams. And so this sense of connectedness and a safety net and all of that in their formative years was really strong. Now, they came out of college to some tough times as well, so I'm not dissing on millennials at all, but we're just talking nervous system, right? We're building
Hmm.
right here. So our Gen Xers had seen their parents like bleed company colors and be so, like stuck in where they were. And then in the middle of the 80s, when they were in their formative years, Gen Xers, their parents came home with a little slip of paper and it was pink. And all of a sudden, the company was letting people go. It was the first time
Yeah.
we'd had the downsizing, right sizing, cutting. And so Gen Xers weren't just employees, they became free agents in their generational code, how they see themselves. Just as the boomers were employees and the traditionalists were workers, Gen Xers were free agents who constantly were vigilant. They kept their head on a swivel, they kept their bullet points hot and their resume fresh. Because if something cataclysmic happened, like the .com goes .bomb, they needed to be ready to move. Well, that to a nervous system to always be looking out and never feel like anybody's looking out for you gets a nervous system that's constantly revved. And why that matters as a leader, and because so many Gen Xers have told me, I've had to change my leadership style more in the last 10 years than anything else, because they came through scrappy, and looking out for themselves and maybe their buddy on either side that was a Gen Xer peer. But now the millennials grew up and their parents and their schools gave them language and literacy around emotions. When there was a tragedy like a shooting, they brought in grief counselors and they
Mm.
talked about these kind of emotions. So millennials come into the workplace and they have an elevated literacy about emotional language and emotional need, which gets a lot of the baby boomers originally saying, "What the heck?" and using words and terms that were derogatory towards millennials, that were undeserved derogatory, calling them entitled or calling them snowflakes or calling them all these things, because they had not had that kind of nervous system support when they came in. And now they
Mm.
gave it to their kids as parents, but when someone else's millennial child came in and expected that from them, they were like, "Huh, you, I'm not your parent. Why do you expect that from me?" Then come our Gen Z. Now,
Mm.
our Gen Xers being underprotected as kids overprotected their Gen Z kids. They did like the full pendulum swing back to say, I am so going to make sure that this kid knows their worth, knows I love them, knows they have agency, knows they can speak up. And so they really overprotected them in real life, to the degree that sometimes it actually hobbled the Gen Z kid being able to get out and make relationships, because if they were shy, their Gen Xer parent was like, that's okay, they're shy. And so they didn't require the Gen Z kid to get out and make some of those connections and make some of those interactions and relationships. And then the pandemic happened. And now we've got the shutdown and we've got Zoom school and we've got all these things happening at that critical formative time when their brains are developing. And so it became a really anxious generation in many ways, because they didn't have so many of those interactions that helped them develop a strong nervous system. But then something else really important happened. And I love the work of my colleague, Jonathan Haidt. He wrote a great book called The Anxious Generation. And he points out, he's a Columbia University professor, and he points out that in 2012, we unknowingly did a global experiment on the brain rewiring of an entire generation when we introduced this, the smartphone.
Oh,
And all of a
that's,
sudden, a young person, 7, 8, 9 years old, had the entire world available to them, all the stress of the world, all the games of the world, all the threads of the world, social media and otherwise. And they were constantly having their nervous system and their limbic system triggered by likes, by follows, by comments. And all of a sudden, we saw the self harm and the depression just skyrocket. In 2012, you can see it exactly as the smartphone comes in. We see all this self-harming and isolation and anxiety just around the world skyrocket. And so our Gen Z were younger in their developmental nervous systems when they were introduced to an addictive substance called a smartphone and
it
worldwide
is an
access.
addictive substance.
An
Yeah.
addictive substance, but they were unmonitored. They were totally overprotected in life, but they were underprotected online. And so this is why we see with Gen Z absolute hunger and demand at work to have literacy around mental health, to have
Mm.
literacy around nervous system regulation, because they grew up understanding this is too much, too fast, too soon. I need to be able to regulate and titrate and take balance. They grew up with their parents saying it was okay to take a well-being day from school. If they
Mm.
were dysregulated, they were allowed to stay home. So now when they come into the workplace and they say, I need a well-being day, and people are like, a well-being day? Like, what are you talking about? It's why it's so important for leaders to do things like do PTO, paid time off, where you get to choose how you mix and match your time. That you don't have to make up a fatal illness, to actually be able to say, I'm going to be working from home, or I'm going to be titrating in and out, because these are things that are Gen Z and our millennials too. And by the way, Gen Xers love it and boomers appreciate it too.
Yeah, boomers also
Let's
need
all come
it.
together like that.
And they're recognizing as the other generations are taking it, they also need it.
That's right. When there's things that our baby boomers dreamed of, like work-life balance, and
Mm.
our Gen Xers desired, but there were 80 million baby boomers eating their lunch, that our
Yeah,
millennials were raised by their parents to believe it was their right to demand, and our
yeah.
Gen Z know from their Gen Xer parents that they deserve. It's a virtuous upcycle when we give Gen Z and Gen Alpha coming after them something that they know they deserve. It flows upward. Millennials, it's something that they were demanding. It was something that Gen Xers were desiring, and it was something that baby boomers wanted as well.